Sorry for the delay, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the City of Troutdale Budget Committee and the Budget Committee for the Urban Renewal Agency for the City of Troutdale. This is a work session, December 3rd, 2024. And if we could have roll call, please.
Annie Stephenson.
Here.
G. Bent.
Here.
Chris Barney.
Will not be here this evening.
Victoria Rizzo.
Here.
Rich Allen.
Here.
Heidi Turner.
Here.
On the screen.
Somebody needs to make sure that
Paul Wilcox.
Here.
Counselor Rittman.
Here.
Counselor Caswell.
Here.
Counselor One.
Present.
Counselor White.
Here.
Counselor Wittrin.
Present.
Counselor Glantz.
Present.
Mayor Lauer.
he said he would not make it tonight.
Okay. We have a quorum. Okay, and with that, we will go to the next item on the agenda, and this is nominations for chair and vice chair for the Budget Committee for 24-25.
So this is Rich Allen. I actually really like the work you do, so I nominate you, Tanny Stephenson, for chair.
Second.
Okay. Other nominations for chair?
Yeah, I would like to nominate Paul Wilcox.
Okay. All right.
I'd like to second the nomination for Tanny Stephenson.
That was already said.
It was already seconded.
Victoria did it.
Yeah.
I have another one then.
Okay.
Are we gonna do this one at a time?
Hang on. Is there a second for the Paul Wilcox nomination?
I'll second it.
Okay. All right, any other nominations for chair? Okay, at this time, I guess I'll go ahead and do nominations for vice chair.
Might be simpler to, I'm just thinking it might be simpler just to vote on the chair nomination, then take vice chair, since we have a vote. It's up to
Sure.
you.
Sure, that's fine. Okay,
I would move we close the nominations for chair.
motion to close?
Second,
No,
you don't need it.
You need a motion.
you need, I need a motion to close.
I
Thought
made
Dave
a
made a
motion.
motion.
I made a motion to close.
Second.
All right. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Aye.
motion closed. And I guess the first one we would take is Tanny Stephenson for chair. And probably have to do a roll call, I'm guessing.
Annie Stephenson.
Oh, you call me first?
Or do you want to go through and have them just say the name? Because you're just going to get silence and then they doesn't want to vote for you, as opposed to,
Well, yes or no.
okay.
Oh, and just say the name?
Yeah, say
Okay.
Danny or Paul.
We'll do that. We have two on the ballot. Say the name of the individual you want to vote for. Okay?
Okay. Annie Stephenson. For yourself?
Yeah.
Okay. G. Bent.
Typically do
Stephenson.
Victoria Rizzo.
Stephenson.
Rich Allen.
Stephenson.
Heidi Timberman.
Stephenson.
Paul Wilcox.
Just want to mention, I think when Tanny was advertising the opening, it said 24-25, wouldn't it be 25-26?
No, because it's the remainder of this year, and then it is starting of next year.
New appointments. June.
Oh, okay, I'll vote for Tanny.
Ritma,
Tanny Stephenson.
Counselor Caswell,
Tammy Stephenson.
Counselor One,
Uh, Paul, you're making me laugh. I'm gonna vote for Paul Wilcox.
Counselor White,
Chair Stephenson.
Counselor Woodrum,
Stephenson.
Counselor Glantz.
Tanny Stephenson.
Okay. All right. At this time, we would like to open the nominations for vice chair.
I'll nominate Victoria Rizzo.
Okay?
Second.
Motion and a second for Victoria Rizzo. Other nominations for vice chair?
Nominate Rich Allen.
Okay, and Rich Allen, do we have a second for Rich Allen?
Second.
Okay, and other nominations for vice chair? All right,
I move we close nominations for vice chair.
Second that.
okay, we have a motion and a second to close nominations. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, nominations are closed. Okay, with the two-headed animal again, we'll just state the name of the person that you would like to fill that role.
Tanny Stephenson,
Victoria Rizzo.
Jean Ben,
Alan.
Victoria Rizzo,
Me.
Rich Allen,
Victoria.
Heidi Timberman,
Victoria.
Paul Wilcox, Paul Wilcox,
Sorry, I was muted. Rich Allen.
Counselor Ritma,
Victoria Rizzo.
Counselor Caswell,
Victoria Rizzo.
Counselor One,
Rizzo.
Counselor White,
Victoria Rizzo.
Counselor Woodrum,
Victoria, please.
Counselor Glantz.
Victoria Rizzo.
Okay, that would be Rizzo. All right. Okay. You ready? You're next.
Great. I'm next. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for your service tonight and your service throughout the year. The responsibility of serving on the Budget Committee may not take a lot of nights away during the year, but that's at least 3, maybe 4 nights away each year. And even though you on Zoom are not here, you are still taking your attention away from your family. So thank you so much for your time here. It's important because the role you serve is very critical to the management of the city and holding the staff accountable for almost $70 million of expenses. So we really appreciate your oversight and your input and your willingness to be involved in this very important process, because the money we spend mostly comes from you and your neighbors. And that's why we appreciate you making us responsible for it. As for that spending, it is important for me to let you know, to remind you, because I say it every year because it hasn't changed, is that you have a great staff. And they are very responsible and feel very accountable to properly spending the money that you give them the ability to spend. We're also blessed to have a wonderful finance director. Eric Mueller has been a great service to the city because of his integrity and his hard work. And for Eric, I have to give credit where credit is due, because Dave Nelson, your former police chief and city manager, takes all of the credit for Eric being here and blessing us because he hired him about 15 years ago or so. So thank you, Dave. I'll tell him when I see him again. But we are really blessed to have Eric. But it's not just Eric, it's the whole staff. The staff in the finance office and the staff of the city does a great job of feeling like they are accountable to you for the spending that they do. And that's the nice thing about a smaller organization, unlike the federal government, unlike the state government, unlike the county, unlike Metro. It's really hard to see where the money's going and who's responsible for it. But here at the city level, you get a real good, bottom line view of what's going on and where the money's going. So we really appreciate your involvement here. A couple things of note. First of all, the city is doing well financially. We, as usual, are spending less than budgeted. I mean, Eric in a minute's gonna go through the charts for year to date. As a third of the year has gone by, we've spent on average less than a third of our budget. The general fund budget is only spent 27% of allocation, even though we're 33% through the year. That's something we try to do every year. As we've told you before, we always make sure we spend less than the budgeted amount. Second of all, the future does contain several concerning financial obligations. As you're probably aware, we're in the middle of negotiating a new law enforcement and a fire contract. And those contracts are probably going to require the city to pay a bigger increase than we're used to. Under our current 10-year contract, the most we have an increase for is 4.5%. But both the sheriff's office and the city of Gresham are taking different approaches to how they want us to pay, which both reflect a substantial increase of what we're paying. If you'd read the Champion article I did recently, that's their opening salvo that we have to deal with. It's not a pretty sight. So what we're working hard, we've got a contract negotiating committee with the sheriff's office. We're working right now with the city managers on the fire contract to get us at least in the same ballpark so we can actually talk numbers. And so we're working really hard on those. The third other big number that we have to deal with every year is the PERS obligation. Every public agency in Oregon is having large increases in their PERS obligations. And even though ours may not be as much as some, it still is more than the 3% that property taxes go up every year, is that obligation to PERS. So those are things that we have to be cautious of. But as I've told you for years, the reason we continue to build our ending fund balance, as Eric hates me to say, our savings account, last fiscal year we ended with over $10 million in the ending fund balance, and that's kind of our hedge against higher expenses. But we have to be careful. It may help us in a short term, but you can't keep spending it and get to the cupboards being bare and talk about other ways of doing things. Because there's only two ways to deal with it. Either you cut expenses or you increase revenues. And something that the under new mayor Ritma and many new council members, they're going to have to be talking about next year. Staff's going to bring up issues about alternative funding sources that may have to look to. A lot of cities, in fact, probably a majority of cities in the state, utilize additional funding sources. They look at utility fees, they look at local option levies, they look at joining a fire district. That's something that Troutdale has not had the necessity to look at, but we're getting into a situation with those increased costs that we may have to. It's a discussion. But finally, tonight is not about those kind of decisions. It's not about budget cutting or revenue increasing. It's about a report on how things are going, where things we think they're going to go. And all of this is pretty much a lead up to the budget committee meetings that will start in April. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for listening to the information that Eric's providing. And most importantly, tonight's not usually the forum to get into too much detail, but all that Eric and I are available anytime any citizen or member of the budget committee wants to come into the office and sit down and ask detailed questions about expenses, about the budgeting process, and about the budgeting law. So know that we are available anytime to open up whatever you want to talk about in the office. So let us know if we can do that for you. So again, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to chair the budget committee this year. I really appreciate the faith that you show in me. And, 2 years ago, this committee voted to push to have the police and fire contracts looked at earlier so that we can get in front of it. And that process has been ongoing. Those groups have been meeting. And I'll say this, we're making a lot of progress, but at the same time, it's going to cost more money. And you really don't know where the money's going to come from. And there's a lot of theories out there, there's a lot of solutions, there's a lot of ways to approach it. But at the end of the day, when you look at this, the citizens are going to hold us accountable for the services that we provide and what it costs to provide them. There's an expectation, that people expect us to meet. And like when they dial 911, they're thinking somebody's probably gonna come. A lot of that's our job, to make sure that we have those things in place. And if that costs more money, where do we get the money from? Do we ask people to give more money? Do we cut something back? What do we do? Because we've done a great job to this point, you look at it, we spent 5.4 million last year, less than we budgeted in the general fund. That's pretty incredible, but that's also an awful lot of money. So what does this all look like going forward? And how do we get there? How do we keep our reserves where we need to keep them? And how do we keep the services where we need to keep them? Because this is going to be a very tough year for us. Everything doesn't happen this year, but we have to get ready for it because it's going to happen the next year, right? We have to start working that direction. And that's not doom and gloom or fear, that's just the reality of where we are. And we're not the only city in this position, but we've got to be creative and we've got to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it and what's important. What's important to you, what's important to your neighbors. Because at the end of the day, I got to say, it's really not Ray and Eric's and staff's job to figure out what the priorities are. It's the council's job and the budget committee's job collectively to do that. And we have to own that. We have to do that. That's our job. That's why we're here. We're going to get a lot of information tonight, and we're going to try to get a little bit of a taste of where this is going to go so we know what we're dealing with in April and May of this year. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It's a lot of work, especially in a short amount of time, and really appreciate all the work that you've done to this point and the work that you're going to do to get the budget done. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Mueller.
All right, thank you, Chair Stephenson. Hopefully I can get my computer to cooperate here. There we go. Okay. Already took care of that. And is my microphone on or off with the light? It's on. Okay. Okay, so welcome. You've had the first few items on the agenda taken care of. So tonight, the purpose is to inform, update, answer some questions, glance back at last year, look to the future, and get you thinking for April of 2025. I can hardly believe it's going to be 2025, but then again, it is December. So for tonight, quick review of the ground rules. The Budget Committee is governed by the local budget law, so we have a lot of duties and responsibilities as specified in the state statute, but there's also limitations. So the Budget Committee has the duties to, oh wow, top of the page is, we need to adjust that for some of the slides, but anyway, receive the budget message, hear and consider testimony, so forth, but we do that at the official meeting in April because there's a number of publication requirements that are required in order to even do those things. So pre-season, which is what this is considered, before the formally noticed one, the limitations. You can have general discussions on the city's organization, on the fund structures, and visions and goals, general economic conditions, which we'll cover a bit of, current year budget, prior year budget, but the limitations are you can't make decisions about the coming year. You can't make specific determinations, estimates, or appropriations for different line items, et cetera, specific programs that you want to fund more, or you want to cut. Those are required to be done after all the formal notifications are done as part of the spring process. So in general, talk about issues, relative priorities. You want to put more money into the water park and less money into the putting green, in general, but not specific amounts that you might want to do for those things. And of course, talk about future issues. So any questions about the ground rules? Didn't think so, not usually the case. So financial overview, so just to clarify where we are. So the budget cycle, the top one is last fiscal year, and that reporting box, that's what I'm neck deep in with the auditors, trying to get the audit report completed by the end of the calendar year, which we've got to get it filed with the state. The current year that we're in is the budget that we're operating under, the 24-25 budget, and we're in the implementation and monitoring stage. And of course, we're getting ready, the planning and the budget development for the coming budget cycle. So last year turned out fine, this year's good so far. July 1, there's going to be inflation impacts and the economy continuing to slow, maybe, as well as other impacts. So how did last year turn out? There we go. And you have a handout, which top of the page anyway. One that says last year at the bottom. That's the one we've got up here on the screen. And this is just the annual recap that I provide each year, looking at what the expense was, what the budget was, what the expense actually was, and then the same thing, the budget for the revenue and the actual for the revenue. That first column of percentages, we like to make sure that those are always below 100, because if they're over 100, I'm going to get hauled off the local budget law jail. The next set of columns are the revenue side, and of course we like it when those numbers are over 100, because that means we got more revenue than we had anticipated. The last column is just basically a net, strictly for that year. Doesn't consider ending fund balances, doesn't consider carryover balances, doesn't consider anything. It just is the current year's revenue and expense. So as you can see, the general fund, we had a net expenditure, 610,000 more than revenue for the year. So our ending fund balance went down that amount. You look down the page, the great big number is that full faith and credit fund 27 number, the 3.5 million. That's related to the payoff of the $5 million of full faith and credit debt that we had put onto the schedule and had been putting money aside. And then, as you can see over on the columns for the expenditure, we paid out the $2,269,000 and paid that off. That was a combination of that year's revenue plus what we had carried forward. Any questions on those numbers? We'll look at some of the projections and come back to some of it later.
Is it possible, this is Kevin Minkoff, I'm an alternate. Do I have permission to speak or no?
Go ahead, since you have a question. Go ahead.
My question is it possible in future reports that you have a column which actually shows the results of the budget expense versus budget revenue? Because if you take an item, for example, like Parks Improvement Fund, where it just shows a minus $1 million, you've actually done better from a budgeting standpoint than this number would indicate, because you actually collected more money than was budgeted, and you've actually spent less money that was budgeted. So from a purely budget standpoint, you have a success, even though what we're looking at is a negative, a deficit of $1,052,000. So I think it would be very helpful from a review standpoint to actually see what are the results based on the budget.
Well, that's what's in those first two columns on the expense side, which shows you that it was at 57% of what was budgeted was what was spent. And then the next two columns is the revenue side, where you point out that we got more revenue.
What I'm talking about is a netting of those two.
Any other questions?
See,
Okay, so, oops, went backwards, sorry about that, there we go. So, general fund, the 23-24 budget. Looking over at the third column there is the actuals, you know, that those other columns occur over the course of the year, but we had actual revenues of 16.9, which ended up being 518,000 more than what we had budgeted, so that was a positive. There we have the expense category where we spent the 5.4 million that the chair talked about earlier, under what was budgeted. Then we show our operating net, what was on the previous page, the 610,000 under. So positive there, and then this sort of shows us how it feeds through the balance. We started out with the 10,000,009. We had the revenues, the expenditures. We ended up with down at 10,000,003. So that was the reduction from that top line from the net of the revenues and the expenditures over the course of the year. That's just another way of looking at those revenues and expenditures. You'll see there on the 23-24 column there, the red line is slightly above the green line. That's where our 610,000 variance is that was on the previous pages. And so that's our ending fund balance, second column of the 23-24 column is down slightly. That's the 610,000 from the prior year's ending fund balance. And then of course, the light blue, purple, whatever shading that is, that's the sort of projection out into the future, all of which is subject to change. And we'll come back to these later on in the meeting. So where are we this year? This is the reverse side of that piece of paper, the snapshot, the camera, this is what Ray had referred to earlier about when we're a third of the way through the year. This is just a snapshot, and of course it's out of date by the time I even get it on paper because there's transactions occurring all the time, and this is only through October. I always take the opportunity to point out the big additional outflow that's occurred in the general fund, and that's because we get half approximately of our revenue for the general fund through property taxes. And of course, we don't start to receive any of those property taxes until mid-November when the tax bill's first payment is due. So that's why we have to have that ending fund balance for the general fund, because we have to have something to pay July, August, September, October expenses before property taxes start rolling in. Again, all the rest of them are just, again, a snapshot point in time. No activity on some of them, particularly some of the more specialized capital project funds, et cetera. Any questions on the snapshot?
Yes, again.
Okay.
Kevin Minkoff, alternate. How do we know whether the revenue actual is on target? It's only 12%, of course, but based on exactly what you said, you're not expecting it. But on a budgeting basis, what would be expected for the first 4 months of the year would probably be also maybe 1.8 million, in which case 1.8 million is on target for the first 4 months. But otherwise, how would we know that?
We don't budget with a monthly expected revenue.
So you don't budget the cycle, the cyclical flow.
Right, and we'll see some of that here in just a moment as we look at some of the bigger components here. So property taxes, I show this slide each time we update it. I think I had it at 15%. My preliminary numbers that I've gotten from the county, which I don't have all of their reports yet, coming in at 12. You know, that's why I say it's still projected. You know, the year out, I'm using the default 3% because I can't really adjust that till we get further into the budget cycle, get some input from the building inspection folks to get some sense of what new improvements might be coming onto the tax rolls that it might be in addition to the ordinary 3% increase on existing improvements, but we'll get to that in the spring. So that's just, wow. Okay, is there something we can do to change because all of my titles are not gonna be visible to anybody on.
Yeah.
It's showing up on Zoom that way?
Yeah.
Okay,
We can
well,
see
I
it,
guess
yeah.
it's just, for the folks in the room, I'll just have to tell you what that is. That's the property tax graph. The very last line there is estimated, because if I put what the actual is, the line would go zoom down to 0, and, you know, most of you around the room would have a heart attack, so I didn't wanna cause any cardiac issues. But, you know, it's continuing to grow, it's increased. This is the transient lodging tax. That's what we've gotten through October. It's real lumpy in that it only gets paid quarterly. So that represents the July, August, and September quarter that the hoteliers have filed their report. We won't get the next reports till late January into February as they file for October, November, and December. So it's always volatile. That's the county business income tax, the BIT. Again, it runs on a lag, is one of the reasons, and let's see, that's probably the best way to show it. That's a graph out of the county's forecast report update, but that sort of shows you how it grows over time. And there will be a month throughout the course of the year where the county will say there'll be no distribution this month because of all the filings. They haven't been able to get it reconciled, and so they end up doing a catch-up the following month. So the revenue of it, the receipt of the revenue is also very lumpy, and it tends to be from a concentration from a smaller number, relatively speaking, of large payers, and then a huge number of smaller payers that only pay annually. So it's one of the things that drives me nuts every year as I'm trying to put the budget together in March. We usually get our biggest inflow of revenue from this in May, which of course I've already long past had our budget meetings, and it drives me crazy every year trying to speculate what we're going to get. But, and then all of those previous ones were the general fund. And I've been asked about this a few years ago. This is the gas tax. The blue line is the state gas tax. The orange line is there it is at the bottom. Okay, the local gas tax. Of course, we've only got a couple months in. This also lags because the fuel dealers have to file. ODOT does the reconciliation. It's usually another 45 days after the end of the month before they then get it filed to us. So that certainly doesn't represent a full 4 months of activity. But you can see the trend. I had gotten a question from Mr. Wilcox about some of the numbers going back a year or two ago about why there's the divergence. And part of it is that the orange line is based on the local gas tax, which is strictly a 3% per gallon tax. It's one component. Whereas the blue line is the state gas tax that's shared primarily to fund ODOT. 20% of it is allocated to a pool for cities. But it has a fuel tax, which the state raised. It's also got the truck weight mile tax goes into it. And then there's also a tax for title and registration components that go into it. So it has multiple components. It's not strictly a gallon based, and the state had raised the fees on all of those components. So that's why it's growing a little bit, slightly different line than the local. So any questions on those revenue sources? Okay. Do an update on the economic overview that is going to be facing us as we go into the process. The push-pull, supply chain, labor force, job openings, infrastructure projects. This is out of the states, from the new State Economist, just published their December report. And as they put it, the economic resilience is complicating the inflation normalization. They talk about it, that the campaign to bring it back to normal is incomplete. The pace of GDP continues to moderate, but it's still running above the capacity, which is creating inflation pressures, which are proving to be persistent, as they put it, as the economy continues to face labor and capacity constraints. So GDP, which that's, you know, that's been the GDP over the past couple of years. You can see it's trending down slowly as a result of interest rates that had been increased. This is a little bit longer schedule. You can see the forecast going into next year, expecting a much lower fourth quarter GDP. I'll be surprised if it actually comes in that low, given what we've seen just so far in the holiday shopping season. The components of the GDP, sort of the purplish ones, are essentially consumer spending. And so you can see that the consumer has remained strong over the period. The light bluish one is essentially what is business spending, green is government, and the red is the net of imports, exports. So the consumer has been largely driving the ongoing GDP growth. Inflation's continuing to slowly downward, trend. It hasn't moved certainly as rapidly as everybody would like. There's continued to be a goods to services shift. There's still some labor constraints. The supply chain has largely been solved. Inflation peaked in June of 2022, depending on the measure, whether it's 7% or 9%, depending on the index used. This is the most recent kind of measurings of it. You can see it tick back up in October, but it's coming down significantly earlier. Whether it gets down far enough, we'll have to wait and see. It's a little bit longer time frame to show that it's continuing to come down, but the last report or two, we've had a slight uptick where inflation is sort of proving sticky. It's not going down, continuing to trend down like we would like it to. Yeah, I guess that's a little bit longer. I can't see my titles either. So let me see if I can move this. Oh, there we go. Consumer price index, yeah. So that's the measure over a little bit longer time frame, the core and the headline. You can see that it's come down significantly from the peak in 22, but it's ticking back up. The various components, the food and energy, which are of course the most volatile parts of the components, core goods and services, but you can see all are trending down, which is what we want to see. This is the more focused West region version versus the national. Recap since 2000, the kind of components that are being measured, energy being the largest their component, medical care right behind it. The college tuition one isn't really part of the basket that's measured, but it's put in there as reference. And then, as we've talked about in prior years, your personal CPI that you experience depends on how you consume what are the components of the basket. And if, as you can see, 42% of the overall measure is housing. Well, if you're a renter and you're having to sign a new lease, you're getting slammed with rate increases. If you're one of those fortunate folks who owns a home with one of those 3% mortgages from 5 or 7 years ago, well, your housing component isn't changing because your rental cost isn't being renewed and going up. Of course, you're still going to the grocery store, and you're still buying fuel. Those are the second and third components. But again, your individual experience on CPI is going to vary, again, depending on how you consume the components of that basket. Housing, as I was just mentioning, you know, those are the mortgage, 30-year mortgage rate. It's ticked back up, unfortunately, which is undermining some of the improvement on the housing measure for inflation. Troutdale, their target or their component average calculation, 481,000, showing it increasing, continuing to increase over time. 1.8% appreciation in value based on their calculations from October of the prior year. So, you know, it's not anything like the 2007, 2008 where we had values going the other direction. It's not cycling up at 20% a year either, which helps from an affordability standpoint. So the consumers we talked about, consumer confidence has ticked back up. The comparison, you know, the business confidence is that lower line. It's at a much lower level. It's moving in the right direction, but in general, consumers are more optimistic than small business owners are, but the small business side is improving. Conference Board talked about their most recent measure for November, reached the top of the range that it has for 2 years, primarily based on the labor market and the availability of jobs is impacting the consumer confidence outlook. So, which takes us right into employment. Of course, the huge spike in unemployment related to COVID, and then having had it come down significantly, it's still at, while not record low or completely lowest level, it's still at very low levels. This is the Oregon US comparison. Again, down Oregon's right at about 4.05, isn't quite 4.1, but it's a little bit more than 4.0. Also, the participation rate is back to almost record levels for the prime age employment population. So that's a positive from a productivity and capacity standpoint. Current employment, you know, for the past year, the growth in the various components, private education and health, government, other services, professional has seen the increases. We've seen a decrease in construction as the one that trailed the most, but overall it's a healthy growth over the course of the year. Labor conditions are stable. I mean, these are slides that I stole out of the state economist slideshow that he did for the legislature update. But as they point out, the wage growth is continuing to, you know, re-accelerate. This is a slight aside from the employment section, but since I was getting stuff out of the forecast we have a new state economist, and he has chosen to change some of the models. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview just on your personal standpoint. If you recall last year when you were or earlier this year when you were filing your tax returns for 2023, you benefited from the kicker. And the kicker was 5.6 billion, record high. The current kicker for the current biennium is estimated based on the previous model about 1.8, so about a third of what that record was. Still a positive. It'll be received when you file your 2025 returns. And then the new model, which is less conservative and likely to reduce the 2027 kicker. So I'm wanting to give you a heads up that the state economist has refined the model. So don't necessarily count on getting those big personal Oregon tax refunds. That was my aside there. So economic summary, we talked about recession last time around, depth, diffusion, and duration. There's been an ongoing debate about, is the Fed going to give us a soft landing or a hard landing, a crash landing? The discussion more recently, last 6 months or so, has been about a no landing. But in any case, both of those measures are positive. The Fed's dual mandates, inflation and employment, both are in employment is in good condition. The inflation piece is, the trend is going in the right direction. It hasn't gotten to their target yet. Come on, click. There we go. So can't see that. Anyway, the recession fears have declined. That's a graphing of the recession expectations, and you see it come down significantly over the course of over the past 12 months. This is sort of the current graphing or expectations of a soft landing, a hard landing, where the Fed is typically pushes an economy until it goes into a recession to break the back of inflation. That's the smallest percentage, and now the no landing scenario has crept up. So soft landing means that the Fed accomplished their task of taming inflation without triggering a recession. A no landing occurs when the economy continues to grow despite them having raised interest rates to slow the economy down. And that appears to be how we're going to cycle through this, but we aren't quite there yet. Headline regarding income, American Household Survey income jumped in October, double the consensus rate that the economists forecast, and the fastest since March. So again, part of that consumer spending, the consumer supporting the economy and the GDP flows through from that into that consumer confidence chart that we had seen earlier. So as we look forward, the title up there says political and economic risks. And there's a number of them we're facing. They're risks doesn't necessarily mean that all of them are going to come true, but they're risks that could occur. Of course, we've got the geopolitical risks, what could happen with the ongoing conflict in Gaza and Ukraine, the ongoing kind of imperial or expansionist saber rattling that's been going on with China. The president-elect has announced tariffs on multiple days at different levels for different countries. Tariffs are, not making any political judgments, but tariffs are mathematically inflationary because they increase the cost of goods. How much inflation somebody experienced goes back to that pie chart, and how much of that pie chart you consume, and how much of that comes from any particular import that experienced a tariff. So it's going to vary by person, but tariffs also have the risk of creating part of the trade war retaliation, as it were. There's risk that if inflation continues to tick upward, that the Fed will pause on its rate reductions, because that's how increasing interest rates is how it slows inflation. So having done cuts at the last two meetings, it's expected they're going to do a cut next week or the week after. Anyway, their December meeting. The question is, going into next year, if inflation is ticking back up, they may be in a situation where they can't continue to cut interest rates because it's fueling an increase in inflation. That's a risk. There's 12 appropriation bills that fund the federal government. Thus far, 2 of them have been approved. So the vast majority, 80–90% of the federal government is operating under what's known as a continuing resolution that expires on December 20th. So there's a risk based on how tight the margins are, how fractious different components of the political parties are, that we will run into a government shutdown just before Christmas. The expectation is not, but it's a possibility. It could be a short-lived one of a couple of days, but could drag out as well. There's expected to be a fight over the speakership in January. The current speaker is leading contender, but again, given the fractious nature of it, and based on the 3 vacancies that are going to have occurred as a result of resignations to join the new administration, till probably about April, when the special elections occur, the Republicans are literally going to have a 1-seat majority in the House for the first 90 days or so, where it'll be 217 to 215. And so if one person changes their vote, it will be a tie and legislation will fail. So given the fractious nature, that's going to create some additional challenges, particularly given the ambitious agenda that's being proposed by the incoming president for their first 100 days. Also, the debt ceiling, which we haven't heard about for a while. We're going to have a debt ceiling fight. The current exemption on the debt ceiling expires on January 1st, 2025. Based on the current law, the debt, whatever it is equal to on January 2nd, 2025, becomes the debt ceiling. So at that moment, the Treasury can pay based on what it has in the bank, as it were, and as receipts come in. The Treasury will have to move into what's known as the extraordinary operations or methods, I forget the term that they use. Usually gives them anywhere from 2 weeks to 90 days of maneuvering room. Extraordinary measures, that's the term I was looking for, to manage the cash flow and continue to pay bills while the debt ceiling is in place. I say fight because it is a fight every single time, and again, as divided and as fractious as it is, it's likely to be more difficult this time through. That may likely trigger what's known in the marketplace as the bond vigilantes, large holders who dump billions of dollars of sales of Treasury securities as essentially as a message over their displeasure about the fiscal choices being made. That creates real volatility in the marketplace, which then accelerates the pressure and just makes it even more volatile. I mentioned the December 20th shutdown risk. It's most likely going to get pushed out about 90 days. It should be, usually expires on a Friday night, so they have the weekend to maneuver if need be. Should push it out to March 21st. Again, expect much more of a fight at that time versus it just being a risk in December. And then over the course of next year, the big battle is going to be over the TCJA, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, or referred to as the Trump Tax Cuts of 2017. They expire at the end of 2025. And so the big battle in Congress is going to be the brawl over renewing the existing conditions, tweaking some of the provisions potentially. The current estimate is that it would cost $4.6 trillion to renew the existing programs, which based on the budget rules, they have to come up with offsets. And of course, that will be part of the big battle. That's certainly going to take them across the spring and the summer and run us probably even past the very bottom one, which is another budget shutdown fight September 30th, because the government's fiscal year ends September 30th. And as I mentioned, 10 of the 12 appropriation bills aren't done yet, and they're unlikely to get done until March or April, and then they'll be right around the corner, be back faced with another government funding issue. All of those, this is a calculation from Goldman Sachs on their estimate of what those risks in the implementation, what it's going to do to GDP over the course of the coming quarters. You see a big reduction in GDP, largely surrounding the tariffs with China and with automakers is where the two biggest pieces of that would be. The gold piece is related to their calculation of what the immigration reforms that are expected to be addressed in Congress will do to the availability of labor and creating more tightness in the labor market, which will further limit capacity, which will lower some of the GDP. So there's a headline I took out of, I think it was, I don't know whether it was Barron's or anyway, but the stock market is excited about Trump, which was the case. prepare for wild swings. The stock market's already priced in all the positives, and that's partly been the rally that's occurred since the election day. They priced in the expected tax cuts, they priced in deregulation, lower interest rates. The challenge is, basically everything has to go right. If any of those things disappoint, it's more likely the market will trend down because it's already priced in at a higher level. So as he points out, in 2018, we had tax cuts, we had tariffs, and he calls it an uncooperative Fed in that they were trying to fight inflation, so they were raising interest rates. All of those things creates volatility in the market. So uncertainty over political issues and how they'll resolve. The uncertainty equals risk in the stock market. Risk in the stock market results in volatility. So expect a bumpy ride in 2025. I expect 2025 the stock market will end higher than 2024 ends. I just expect there's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. There's going to be some gaps up and down. There could be some big drops depending on some of those risk factors, whether it's the debt ceiling or government shutdowns, where we could have big hundreds of points drop in the stock market on any given day, and then when things get resolved, it zooms back up. So, inflation, it's proved to be sticky. Part of the challenge is, the new policies that are Congress and the administration are looking at. I felt this quote was sort of the best description of it. Such moves could lift goods inflation via the tariffs and lift services inflation, which is the other major component for the economy because of labor shortages, and boost overall demand because of tax cuts. All of those things will push inflation upward. So the Fed is either going to have to start raising interest rates again to try and cool it, or they're going to have to get comfortable and live with not getting to 2%. We'll have to wait and see what they do. So, summary, GDP is going to continue to slow, maybe a bit more so depending on how the tariffs are implemented. And there's a lot of speculation over Trump put big tariffs in place for China in 2018, and then ultimately issued waivers because he got agreements to buy like $33 billion worth of soybeans from American farmers for the Chinese pork industry. So how much of the tariffs will be implemented, how much of them will result in negotiating concessions remains to be seen. Supply chains have largely recovered, continued strong consumer demand as we saw on that one chart, and as the income has continued to rise, as well as the wage rate continuing to increase. There's been a slight softening, that's the slight uptick from the 3.8 to the 4.0 on unemployment. Inflation rate has been declining, but it remains stubborn. It's getting that last mile, as it were, is becoming more difficult. The Federal Reserve may have avoided a recession, but we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. So, any questions on the economic outlook?
Question?
Counselor Glantz.
I want to know where you're putting your 401k monies.
Where I'm personally invested, you mean?
Yeah.
That's a compliment.
Well, my investment portfolio, I try to have a kind of a diversified, I have a lot of it in index funds. Also have a little chunk of it in international, which hasn't done really well recently, but it tends to be a good diversifier. So, but I'm heavily invested in the stock market. I have little exposure to the bond market personally, but I'm not offering any investment advice, so. Okay. So outlook for the upcoming budget, policy assumptions, maintain existing services, avoid staff layoffs, continuation of operations, activities and project status quo. Budget impact items, some are internal, our choice, many are not external. Items that are our choice, service levels, spending initiatives, new programs, URA development assistance, things that are not in our control, property taxes, the economy, legislative changes from both the state and the federal, PERS cost increases as an example. So budget impact items, who makes the decision on them, it depends on the timing. Between now and June 30th, City Council makes those kinds of adjustments to the existing budget. For the budget that begins after July 1st, the committee makes those determinations starting in April for the coming year. I want to quickly jump over, touch base on the Urban Renewal Agency, because that's the other part of our, as we mentioned, budget. That's our urban renewal site, of course. The URA, as I mention each time, has 2 funds versus the 30 some odd funds that the city has. It's got the Riverfront Renewal Fund, which is effectively the general fund for the Urban Renewal Agency, and it has the Debt Service Fund, which is strictly limited to receiving the tax increment from the county assessor and making debt payments. So currently the URA has about 5.6 million in cash, has about 8.1 million in outstanding debt. The big project, of course, is the Sandy River Greenway Riverfront Trail and Park. We've got funding from Metro of 1.9 and from Oregon Parks, Recreation and Parks Department, I think is how the abbreviation properly, for the trail. And we have received, I think, 2 reimbursements from one of them and one from the other one, and they're processing the second one. It's basically on a quarterly basis. So we are receiving money from those grants that were approved, which is a good thing. So the URA projects require loans from the city. There's a 100K of TIF back currently. There's 5 million that was in 2018. That was the non-TIF. That was the city borrowed full faith and credit. There's the 1.5 million that we got in 2020 from the state's Brownfield redevelopment fund. Gee, how did I do that? And then the other most recent, the 1.5 million TIF back that was lent to the Urban Renewal Agency last year. That's to provide the city match portion, the agency match portion toward all of those grant funds that we had in order to build the trail. So that's our 8.1 that I was mentioning. The repayment to the city, well, the 5 million we paid off last year to the external lender. The Urban Renewal Agency still owes the city, but based on the agreement between the city and the agency is not obligated to repay the city until it sells the land. And that's the same, essentially, terms that are between the city and the agency for the 1.5 million on the that we got from the state Brownfield fund. So will be more borrowing? Well, the city, will have to borrow again to loan to the URA because it's the only entity that will loan to the URA. But there's a limited amount of available TIF left. So, any questions on the URA overview? Okay. So, property taxes, assessed value, it grows at 3%. The maximum assessed value ends up being the real market value or the 3% assessed value, increased assessed value, whichever is lower. So again, same graph as we had earlier on. Growth in the current year is really from Amazon coming off of the enterprise zone exemption. Last year was their final year. And so that's what the big jump in the base is. Ray mentioned earlier on the PERS pension contribution, the biennium rates, it changes as the state rates change based on the biennium. So we got the new rates from the PERS board in October, I believe it is. And so this is my, back of the envelope calculation on what we're gonna have for cost increase for the 2025 through 2027 rates increase. The projection assumptions, I'm projecting that property taxes grow at 3% to the extent that we have new value come on that can grow more than 3%, but we don't really know what that will be until we get closer to finding out what properties and projects are completed. Also, it is dependent upon the change property ratio and at what rate do they come on to the tax rolls. I've got a conservative, and I'll be right up front about it, I've put all other revenue to grow at 1%. It's probably on the low end, but I'm being cautious. Wages, I've got plugged in to grow at 3% a year, because I don't think the Fed's gonna actually be able to get things down to 2%. But I don't think they're gonna go back up to 5 or 9 or 7 or any of those higher numbers, but I have to pick something. Healthcare always rises at a faster rate. I've got it plugged in at 5%. PERS employer contribution, which I mentioned on the other pages, we're going from 18% of payroll in our current 2-year period that ends June 30th to 22% of payroll come July 1st, expecting another 4% rate point increase the following biennium. Based on the PERS board projections and from Milliman, this coming biennium is when it's supposed to hit the peak and then start to trail off, but the downward slope is at a very gradual pace, but at least it's no longer projected to be going up. I think I jumped past it. Materials and services I just plugged in, that's sort of everything else, office supplies, postage, electric bill, supplies, tools, whatever, I just plugged it in at 3% a year. Of course, it's gonna be different for every one of those components. Fire service contract, of course, talked about that, we have these 2 big contracts that are coming in. Don't know what they're gonna be. And of course, I'm not negotiating with anybody and offering this. I'm just putting in a number so that we have a projection. I put in a 10% increase on the fire contract for next year and another 10% increase the following year on that, and then 5% after that. That's based on essentially what occurred 10 years ago when we renewed the prior fire contract. The first 2 years had a much bigger step up. It was referred to as a true up, as it were. So we had a big step increases in those first 2 years, and then it was at a range that was based on the formula. Police contract, I've just plugged in at 5%. We've never gone through a renewal with them, so we have no kind of history like we've had. Gresham, we've had 5-year contracts going back 20 years, so there's some history there. In the projection, I've cut the capital outlay in the general fund to $150,000. Basically, that's gonna be able to fund vehicle and equipment replacement and maybe some very small project, but they're no longer be able to fund any big projects. Debt service costs in the general fund, currently we're carrying $608,000 a year in debt service costs. $80,000 of that will come down, it will be the final payment next year, so it'll step down to $528 further year out. So last year, as we talked about earlier on, started the year, we had the expenditures, we had the revenues, we had the net of the 610 that got us to the 10,000,003. So that 10,000,003 is our starting number, our budgeted expenditures, budgeted revenues, our preliminary net. We add back the contingency, we get to a net of 2.7 million deficit spending. brings us to an estimated ending fund balance of 7.5 million. So that's the same chart that we touched on very briefly earlier on, but that shows you those top two numbers are where we went from the high down 610, and then the projection of coming down for the end of this coming fiscal year. Again, that's that same chart showing that 610 net and then the projected expense level. And, you know, as I mentioned before, I've got the other revenues in at a very conservative 1% growth. They're probably going to grow greater than that, but, you know, we'll refine things as we get closer to the budget process. So, questions?
Councilor White.
Yeah, I had a question about the battery farm, the new one. What kind of revenue do you see that generating for the city and when?
Excuse me.
3 years.
How long?
I won't have any kind of ability to estimate it until probably a year from now when we get the first set of tax statements with them having it gone onto the tax rolls. They're pushing very hard based on their contractual obligations to be completed and get their at least temporary certificate of occupancy by the end of the calendar year, because they have a commitment that they have to be able to deliver or be in service by January 1. That will then trigger them their start of their 3-year enterprise zone exemption. So a year from now, I'll be able to see how much value the assessor's office has put onto the tax rolls, which they then exempt. So that then I can look out 4 years and say, okay, in theory, 4 years from now, this amount of value will come on and will provide us X amount of revenue. But I don't really have any good idea, but the revenue isn't gonna be there until 4 years, 4 budgets from now.
Okay, so so there's not gonna be like a community, I forget what we called it, I think it was community fee.
Community
like,
service fee?
Yeah, Amazon did.
No, the BESS, battery energy storage system folks, they opted to do the standard state prescribed 3-year enterprise zone program, where basically they just have to qualify and tick the boxes and they basically get approved. So they went for a 3-year exemption versus a 5-year exemption.
Okay.
So, you know, at Amazon, it took until the 6th year before we started to get the revenue. That's what's in our numbers here. Oops.
Mr. Bent?
Can I make a couple comments about the upcoming fire and police? Since they're in negotiations now, we won't be able to have their input until.
You can make a comment, yes.
Okay, that's just comments. On the, hopefully, in the process of negotiating concerning the police services, they're considering similar increases to the lease program for buildings. If they're gonna raise our rates 5%, we should consider a 5% rate increase on the leasing of that building that they would be raising their lease by 5% or something along those lines. And as far as potential cuts to services, hopefully they're utilizing a weighted type system when it comes to the services that the city provides. For example, to me, public safety should be more heavily weighted than, say, parks. Or it doesn't do any good to have great parks if they're not safe to be in. So hopefully the essential services are more heavily weighted than the other services. If they have to make cuts, then they take those cuts proportionally in that respect. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Just clarify, we will get a chance to talk about priorities, right?
About,
Future priorities. We'll have that opportunity, or is that this time now?
a future priority that you may want to,
Yeah, just throw out there.
we could probably throw it out there, but we can't act on it.
Can't do sums. Can't talk about dollars, can talk about direction.
Yeah, just not policy.
Right.
You have a future priority that you want to throw out there?
You want it now?
Sure.
Well, you know, when we're doing these budgets, I kind of like to think about long-term too. Ray would know more about the timing, but I consider, you know, there's the livability and things that we can do to make the town more livable and nicer to be in and that sort of thing. That's all important. But I've been thinking more lately on the things that we should support for safety and so forth, more on the practical side as well. And I guess they're both important enough to be out there. But I wanted to support the idea of what we need to do to get the bridge, the Beaver Creek Bridge, widened, because I consider that unsafe right now, especially in the wintertime when it's dark and rainy and you got pedestrians on there and cars, and you know how well we pay attention when we're driving. Anyway, so that's a high priority for me.
I'm sure that'll be in the proposed budget.
The next one would be, of course, the undergrounding of the utilities. I think we approved that, when was that? 2011 plus or minus, somewhere around there, the undergrounding utilities, and it just slipped away.
Okay, last year we approved to be appropriated $3,642,000 for underground and utilities.
Right. The reason why I bring it up is we had already approved it many years before, and it slipped out. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking about it and don't let it slip out again.
Unless I'm mistaken, we have very little control over that schedule. That's determined by others. So it's not like we're not trying to get it done.
Right.
I think it's just where PGE puts their eggs. Am I correct?
And they weren't kicking in as much money as they used to do, so that changed our projection.
Yeah. But I know we're authorizing that money each year.
Okay.
So it's not like we're the budget committee or the council are really the cog in the wheel here.
And then on less about safety and more about maintenance. The city had last time talked about covered parking for some of the city equipment. I see that more as preservation of what you got and opportunity to work on it. But Glenn had an opposing idea, and maybe I'm missing something, but I still have that in my mind, that at least a discussion at some point. Shouldn't we be doing that? Does it help the employees to have covered parking? Because I know my equipment, when it's out in the rain, it starts to rust up on me and deteriorate a little bit faster.
Right, so I guess if that doesn't come up in the budget, then it's just like, if that's an important thing for you, you propose it and figure out what we should cut to make that happen.
All right.
Okay.
And then if other people have ideas on livability, I'd like to hear it. That's it.
Okay. Mr. Ben?
Just a quick follow-up to the undergrounding fund. Any update or status on Multnomah County's grant on Troutdale Road, bridge over the river, over the creek?
Yeah, as you recall, the undergrounding issue was gonna be tied to the new culvert under Troutdale Road for Beaver Creek. Due to the fact they're gonna be ripping up that section anyway at some point, Right now, the county is through their 30% design process. They got a big federal grant, like $3 million, and right now they're designing, which it's a very slow process to get that design done, get the engineers done, but it's in the process right now. We're communicating still with PGE. They just have really reduced undergrounding to a lower priority and tried to get our engineering department, which doesn't have the capacity to do it, well, why don't you guys design it and then we'll look at it. You know, do all the work. We don't have the staff to do that. So we're working with PG on how to do that. So it's an ongoing process, but it is gonna be slow. The money's there, it keeps growing every year. So it'll get there. It's just not gonna be fast.
At least it's progress on,
Yeah.
at least getting the grant money.
Yeah, that's a good motivator right there to get PG on board, because they're gonna have to be redoing that whole stretch of Troutdale Road and their power supply anyway.
Yeah, that's what I would think that would be the case. And it seems to me, one last comment on it, there should be alternatives for contracting from not having PGE do it, they use subs all the time. That a sub could do what PGE could do with the underground. It doesn't seem like they're very motivated
Yeah,
whatsoever.
it was
I would-
probably
I would
their
look
equipment.
for subcontract.
Yeah, it was about 6 months ago, I had coffee with the East County Maintenance Supervisor, PGE, so we have a contact with them. That's something to ask them, if it's possible to hire that work out.
I sure see you do it all the time.
Yeah, first thing you have to do is you first gotta get the design done, and that's what we're trying to do now. So, we'll ask.
Mr. Wilcox?
Thank you, Chair Stephenson. I actually had a question, comment on the income side, which the Budget Committee doesn't spend a lot of time looking at. I have to provide a little history here first. It has to do with the city utility fees. And back in 2017, the council passed an ordinance that essentially put the utility rate increases, I won't say adjustments because they went up every year. The rate increases were set on autopilot for 2017 through 2021. So in 2022, they were expired, nothing happened. 2023, the council did a kind of a catch-up 8.5% across the board increase. And in that same, that ordinance was before the council, the staff report said I think it's FCS is the company, was going to do a rate review, and I don't think that ever happened. So then come 2024, there was no rate increase. So my question basically is anything happening in 2025, either council directed or FCS being contracted or nothing at all? That's my question. Thank you.
I will get an update from Travis on what's going on with FCS, because I've talked to him several times in the last 3 or 4 months about that, and to get that going, because we're leaving money on the table if we let inflation go above what our utility rates are. If that's not gonna happen soon, that is something we would ask council for again, is just a percentage increase before the study is done. Because it's getting almost to 2 years now since the last increase. It's time to at least do something. Again, the FCF just kind of confirms what the increase should have been. An inflation-related increase does help get there. So that's something the new council will be asked to do, one or the other. I hope within the first 6 months of 2025.
I have a question, Eric. Would it be possible to maybe get a little bit of a breakdown sent out? We saved 5.4 million in the general fund expenses from what we had in the budget to the actual for last year.
That'll probably be in the audit. It's gonna be done in a couple weeks.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what your question is.
Okay, sorry. So we projected an expense of 23 million out of the general fund, and we actually spent 16 million, which is great. It's 5 million less. I was just wondering, like, what made up the 5 million?
3 of it was contingency that wasn't spent.
Okay,
And then there was another $1 million worth of capital projects across parks and facilities that wasn't spent. And then the rest of it is $50,000, $100,000 scattered all over various different line items across the remaining departments.
so for like parks, it would be like the Beaver Creek Bridge and some of those types of things, I'm guessing. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and we had, I think, 394,000 in that year's budget for the skate park. I mean, it's not in the current budget, but the prior year it was there. We didn't spend it. That's why it was part of the underfunding. But that was part of it.
Okay,
Oh,
that helps. All right, Councilor White.
Yeah, I guess, I'm just curious about staffing levels, where are we at? Are we looking to hire someone this year, this coming year? Or, are we gonna go status quo? That slide on PERS was kind of eye-opening.
I will just say right now, just as a general response, I'd be hard pressed to ask the budget committee and the council to add any staff to the general fund balance. With what we got going on with fire, police, and PERS overall, it's just, I think we need to be very cautious about that.
Okay, any other questions? Let's see, maybe.
okay, so. There we go. So meeting wrap up, which we're partly into, I guess. Purpose of tonight was to inform an update, to glance back at last year, to look into the future, get you thinking for April. Prepare to adjourn, comments, etc., and then just save the date. I know you all can't wait to come back here and look at numbers and PowerPoints and spreadsheets and so forth, but those would be the dates in April 2025. And as Ray had said at the very beginning, thank you for your service on the Budget Committee and as well as your time and attention this evening. So I'll leave it to you, Mr. Chair, regarding closing comments and/or when we adjourn.
Do you have any final comments?
No. I've made plenty of comments tonight. I'll just say that I know the budget committee is and will be concerned about those expenses for fire and police. Staff is also concerned, and it's something we have to be thinking about and looking at our general fund, because that's the one most at risk for those expenses. So that'll be definitely a discussion over the next 3 or 4 months to get those numbers and to talk about how to deal with the increases that we anticipate.
Okay, I want to thank Eric and Ray for all the work preparing, mainly Eric, sorry.
Mainly Eric, yeah.
But getting all this information out, thank you very much. And obviously, we look forward to seeing the budget come out in February. No, sorry. He didn't even laugh.
No.
Okay. We'll look forward to seeing that budget and making the decisions that we need to make. And in one of the slides, it said, buckle up, it could be a rough ride. I would just say we can have seatbelts put on the chairs for April, if we think it would help, but this may be one of the tougher ones that we've done. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time this evening and their dedication to the city and this process. And with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Nay.
No.
Oh,
What's that?
what was that, Mr. Juan?
Oh, I was seconding.
Okay, great. We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.